Without further ado, I guess I'd like to introduce our plenary speaker for this afternoon, Kirsti Marohn with Minnesota Public Radio. She's been working on water issues across the state of Minnesota.
Well, thank you very much. I am very excited to be here today. Excited and a little bit nervous because this is a complete reversal of roles for me. Usually, I am the one calling all of you probably know, asking for your expertise and your knowledge and your opinion and putting you on the spot, right? This is very different because now I'm up here in the hot seat, which is good. It's a good thing. But it's going to be a very different experience for me today. So what makes it good is that I am not up here pretending to be an expert, because that's all of your job, right? I mean, you're the ones out there doing the science, doing the research, doing the engineering, the policy making on this vast and critically important topic of water. And that's not my role. And the thing is, though, not everyone knows about the work that you're doing and how important it is. They don't know about these challenging problems that you're working to try to solve. So that's where I come in. My job is to learn from all of you and to try to explain that work, those problems, those stories, and tell them in a way that's meaningful to people and that they can relate to. So I'm thinking that today it will be helpful if I share a little bit with you about how we do that, a little bit about me, a little bit about NPR and what we do, and then also share a few of the stories that I think maybe illustrate how we do that. And they're not necessarily the best stories I've told while I've been at NPR, not necessarily my favorite or the ones that have gotten the most reaction, but I think they kind of illustrate the challenge of trying to explain these problems to people and help them understand. So the idea of having 45 minutes to talk is really exciting and kind of frightening to me, because if you know anything about NPR, you know that a typical story for us is about 4 minutes, maybe 4.5 if we're feeling really long-winded. So 45 minutes is like a lot of time for me. But I want to leave a lot of time for questions at the end. I know you have a way of submitting questions while I'm talking, which is great. So this is your chance to be the reporter and ask me those tough questions that you've been dying to know. But don't make them too tough, please. So just a little bit about me. I am the Central Minnesota reporter for NPR. I'm based out of Collegeville, which is our bureau at St. John's University. I should say I'm based out of there, but I try to spend as much time as I can outside of the office, outdoors, reporting in the field, many times on rivers and lakes. Lakes like this one. Yes, this is an actual lake in Minnesota. Obviously has a little bit of an algae problem. But they're working on it. They're actually doing some really interesting work. The DNR has lowered the lake level and temporarily, and they've planted some native plants on the lake bottom and are trying to use up some of that excess phosphorus that's causing these algae blooms that turns the lake looking like this every year. So that's better, isn't it? This is the lake that I grew up on in the Brainerd Lakes area, and I had a great childhood. Was allowed to roam in the woods and take the canoe out by myself, and I didn't know it then, but it was really a great education for the career that I would end up doing, which is asking questions, observing the natural world around me. So after about 20 years in newspaper reporting, I ended up at NPR about 2.5 years ago. I just want to ask, how many out there are NPR listeners? Oh, I like to see that. That's great. How many of you cannot start your day without Kathy Wurzer and Paul Huttner telling you what the weather's going to be like? Yeah. How many of you are really happy that the member drive is over? Yeah, definitely. So in case you didn't know it already, Minnesota has one of the best public radio networks in the country. With NPR News and classical NPR and the current, we reach more than 1 million listeners each week. And we can be heard all over the state, which is kind of unusual for public radio. We're an NPR member station, meaning you can hear national and international news and the BBC. And we also have news partner relationships with media organizations all over the state. So you might see our bylines showing up in your local newspaper, your community newspapers as well. And we're online. So nprnews.org is where you would find breaking news, photos, past stories, podcasts, shows, that kind of thing. And it's being updated all the time. This is the bureau that I work out of. This is the Collegeville. Did I skip a slide there? Yeah, there we go. So we're all over the state, not just a Twin City station. We have bureaus in Moorhead, Duluth, Worthington, Rochester, Bemidji, and Collegeville. And those reporters live and work in those communities. So they know the people, they know the communities, they know the issues, and they can tell those stories that really give you a sense of place and help us better understand each other and the state that we live in. Yeah, this is the Collegeville Bureau where I work. This is where it all started. In 1967, the first NPR station began broadcasting right out of here. So there's a lot of history in my studio. This is where Gary Eichten and Garrison Keillor got their start, so I have some kind of big shoes to fill. And this photo was taken just a couple of weeks ago when All Things Considered with Tom Cran brought his show on the road up to Collegeville and broadcast live from our studio, which is kind of fun. We're also under the same umbrella as American Public Media, or APM, which produces content that's heard nationally, shows like Marketplace or The Splendid Table, some really great podcasts, like Brains On, which is a science podcast for kids and curious adults. So kids can submit questions, things like, how does an airplane fly? Or when you flush, where does the poop and pee go? Like really important stuff, right? Everybody's done eating, right? But then the kids and some experts try to answer those questions. And APM Reports, which is doing some great investigative work, the award-winning podcast In the Dark, which is starting its 3rd season. And then one of my favorites, which is the APM Research Lab. And there's some really smart people doing some really insightful research and data analysis that then we can turn around and use in our journalism. All of these things have a common denominator, which is curiosity. And NPR places a really high value on curiosity. It's actually in our statement of values to always be curious and to understand and to constantly learn. Which, I mean, what better job could you have than one that pays you to be curious and always learning, right? I mean, that's what you all do. I mean, that's science too, so. One of the things that we do at NPR that's kind of unique is what we call content initiatives, which is when there's a topic that we feel has a lot of interest with readers, very relevant, that we feel like we could bring some insight and expertise and connection and conversation. So you may have heard of our newest one, which is Call to Mind on mental health, or a mental health initiative. So we have a full-time mental health reporter now, and she actually wrote a book about mental illness in the criminal justice system. So, I mean, she's doing some really great work. The water main is the one that I am associated with. That started about 2 years ago. And this was the same thing. I mean, it's taking on this huge topic of water, and my reporting is one facet of that effort. Of course, this is, such a huge topic. I mean, it's everything from the water quality of lakes and rivers to the safety of our drinking water to the availability of groundwater to how climate change and invasive species are changing our waters, to who's going to pay for water infrastructure in the future. So obviously, way more stories than we could possibly tackle. So I'm looking for stories always that can somehow inform and educate our audience, whom I think are some of the most intelligent people out there. I'm a little biased, but. So I approach these stories not as an expert, not like one of you, but sort of like that curious kid, right? And I'm coming to people like you and asking questions, trying to learn and research and read, and then explain to the general public, the audience, why they should care about these stories. One of the things that the water main did early on, there we go, it was some research on Minnesotans' attitudes and knowledge about water. And found some really interesting stuff. Basically, Minnesotans care a lot about water. Their water EQ, or emotional quotient, is really high. I mean, we're the land of 10,000 lakes, the headwaters of the Mississippi River, we have Lake Superior. So people care really deeply about water, and they want to protect it, they want to see it protected. They're even willing to pay higher taxes to do that. But when it comes to their water IQ, their intelligence, their understanding about the issues facing our water and the challenges and the threats that it faces, it's not as good. It's not as broad or as deep as maybe we would hope. So that's where the water main comes in. It's sort of this hub where we can bring together research and journalism and conversations to get people thinking and talking and maybe taking action on water. So how do we find these stories? I get asked this a lot. And what makes a story, right? Like, I get that there is sort of this love-hate relationship between scientists and journalists, right? I mean, we sort of need each other, but there's kind of like a little skepticism, maybe. I mean, you're all doing important work. You want people to know about it, but you're not quite sure you trust journalists to understand it or care or explain it in the way that you'd be comfortable with, right? So I get asked this, how do you decide what to write about? What makes a story? So I thought I would share some of the things that go through my mind when I'm trying to decide if something is worth writing about. And like it or not, this is one of the most important things. I'm trying to tell my audience something that they don't already know. So, even if it's an old problem, is there a new angle? Something different. If there's a connection to a larger trend or issue, that's always a good thing. So maybe that pond down the road from your house that turns scummy green every year isn't news in and of itself. But if it's turning green and scummy because there's a leaking pipe from an industrial plant down the road, and that's related to this larger trend of corporations not accepting responsibility for their toxic waste or whatever, then we're starting to get somewhere, right? There's something with a larger impact at stake here. I am always looking for how humans are impacted, which with environmental stories is not usually very difficult to find. You could have people's health being impacted, their livelihood, maybe the way they recreate, or maybe just those emotional connections to those watery places that people love. So I'm always looking for, to tell those stories because they also connect with listeners and readers as well. People don't want to hear bad news all the time. We've seen that. Research has borne that out. They don't want to hear that the planet is on fire and there's nothing they can do about it because they get angry and they start to feel helpless and they tune out. They want to know what they can do to make a difference, even if it's a small step. And we know that, whereas a small step might not make a difference, wide-scale behavioral changes can. So we're always looking to include in our stories whenever possible, sometimes it's not possible, but whenever possible, if there's some action that people can take to make a difference. So how do we find these stories? I always like to say that I have the best job in journalism. This was a really tough day at the office. This was about 2 years ago, and then Governor Dayton had just announced an initiative, a goal for Minnesota to improve the water quality 20% by 2025, which is a pretty ambitious goal. So we started talking about what that would mean. What would that look like? What would it take to get there? And we wanted to try to illustrate that because, as you know, Minnesota has made some pretty significant strides when it comes to water quality improvement in the last 30, 40, 50 years, especially when it comes to point source pollution. So, things like straight pipes from industrial plants or wastewater treatment plants. But when it comes to non-point source pollution, we have a long way to go still, right? We're dealing with, runoff from agricultural fields and urbanized areas and, emerging contaminants of an emerging concern and microplastics and all these issues that you're all working on. And we wanted to try to illustrate some of those challenges. So this is Whitney Clark. He is director of a nonprofit called Friends of the Mississippi River, and he agreed to take me down the Mississippi to the confluence of the Minnesota River near Fort Snelling. And You've probably seen this picture before, but when the two rivers merge, there's this very distinct line in the water. And you have the Mississippi on the right, and fairly clean up to this point. On the left is the Minnesota River, which picks up a lot of sediment and nutrients as it's running through farmland, and it's this murky color. And especially when you're up above or in a canoe, you can see this very distinct line. And we felt like, what better way to illustrate sort of the challenges that Minnesota faces when it comes to trying to change the land use practices and the economies and the lifestyle and everything that influence water quality. So obviously this doesn't work as well for radio. So we did have some great sounds of Whitney and our photographer Evan Frost paddling as I kind of rode along in the canoe, holding my microphone. So this was the story that we ended up doing, and it talks about how Minnesota has, up until now, relied mostly on voluntary programs to deal with agriculture-related pollution. And some advocates say that's not enough. We need more regulation, more enforcement to really change, to really make a difference, to reach those goals. Other days are a little more work. This was a couple of summers ago when I decided to tag along with a crew from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Is there anybody from the MPCA here today? Oh, good. So if you've never seen this done, they were monitoring a fish in a stream near Brainerd, and they used this long pole with an electric current that stuns the fish. They move it through the water, and they can scoop up the fish then with a net, put them in a bucket, take them to shore, sort them by species, and weigh them and measure them, and it really gives them an indication of the overall health of the stream. And I was very excited when I got to go. I think I was the first person ever in the history of NPR to expense a pair of hip waders. But so this was me, like, following along in the stream, trying not to drop my microphone, and yes, the mosquitoes were very bad. But this work has been going on for more than 10 years now, and it's part of this MPCA effort to monitor the water quality of all 80 major watersheds in Minnesota. And they're really getting this wealth of data about how our streams and lakes and rivers are doing. They're starting to return to the same streams that they did 10 years ago, so they're starting to be able to track changes over time. And it's interesting because fish and invertebrates are a really good indicator because they live in the water, right? So they're constantly being affected by what's happening in that stream. So you might have land use changes in the watershed that wouldn't show up right away in a water sample, but you might see changes in the fish because, as you know, streams that are higher water quality are more likely to have greater diversity of fish species, whereas if it's a low quality stream, it might only have a couple. So that's the story that we ended up doing. Oddly enough, I write a lot about fish, and I don't even fish. So I end up writing a lot about Mille Lacs Lake, maybe too much, but I actually find what's happening up there really interesting because when you get past the hype of the tension over the state regulations and between the business community and the Native American community and all of that, what you have is this lake that, because it's large and shallow, is maybe responding to changes in the climate or in invasive species or whatever, a little more quickly than others. So I wrote about this study that the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe is doing, and it's a telemetry study, and they've captured fish, walleye, and implanted them with a little transmitter, released them back into the lake, and then they've placed these GPS locator devices in the lake. So when the fish swims by, it emits the transmitter emits a little pinging sound. So they can track where the fish are moving throughout the lake, where they're spending their time, and really start to get a sense of what's happening. And the theory that they're trying to prove is that because of the water changes in the lake, we know that the water temperature is warming. We know that for a couple of reasons, the water is getting clearer. There's been improvements in the septic systems. They have zebra mussels, which are filter feeders, so they're eating all the little particles in the water, and the sunlight is able to penetrate deeper into the water. That's not great for walleye. Walleye like cool water. So the theory that they're going under is that the walleye are being crowded into smaller areas of the lake, which makes them more prone to predation, which is, the bigger fish eating the small fish. They're just not thriving like they once were. So that's the theory that they're trying to prove, and this telemetry study is really giving them some useful data to try to see, real-time data to see what's happening with these fish. So this is the story that we ended up doing. And, there's a lot of probably distraction when it comes to Mille Lacs, but I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned that apply not just to Mille Lacs, but to all lakes that are undergoing these changes. So I just threw this photo in there to show you that not every day is pleasant. I've spent a lot of windy days on Mille Lacs, and this is me trying to stay upright on a windy day, and I do wear my life jacket, just so you know. We've been talking a lot about rivers and lakes, but a lot of my time is also spent on drinking water, which for 75% of Minnesotans comes from the ground. And I find this to be one of the most interesting and challenging topics to write about because, as you all know, what we know about what's in our water and the effects it has on us is relatively limited, and it's changing all the time. The science is always changing. So shortly after I started at NPR, there was supposed to be this trial, and this was a culmination of a lawsuit filed 8 years previously by the state of Minnesota against 3M. I'm guessing you're all probably familiar with this case, but just in case not, I'm going to just give you the cliff notes. 3M produced some chemical compounds that were used in a variety of products, everything from Teflon pans to food packaging to firefighting foam used to fight oil fires. And they produced it. It's part of this big class of chemicals known as per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, which took me a really long time to learn how to say that on the radio. But there's more than 4,000 of these chemicals, possibly like 5,000 or more. And 3M produced 2 of these in the East Metro. They were disposed of in landfills. They leached into the groundwater and contaminated the drinking water sources for several cities in the East Metro. So the trouble with these chemicals is that they're very resilient. That's what makes them effective and useful. But they don't break down easily, and they were shown to be bioaccumulating in humans and animals. And they've been linked by a growing scientific body of evidence to a lot of health problems, certain types of cancer, thyroid disease, developmental problems in children. So Minnesota sued 3M for natural resource damages for the groundwater and some surface water contamination. And just as it was about to go to trial, the case settled. Since then, there's been a lot happening with PFAS. There's dozens of lawsuits against 3M and DuPont and other companies. There's been water supplies that have been found to be contaminated around military bases around the United States that use this firefighting foam. There's been calls for federal legislation to regulate PFAS as a hazardous waste and to force companies to accept responsibility for cleaning them up. But before all that, Minnesota was supposed to have this trial. And I wanted to show how individual people were affected by this, because obviously this is a huge and complex case, but we're talking about real people's lives here. So this is Keith Rapp. He lives in Woodbury, and just a disclaimer, he's not just a regular guy, he's a hydrogeologist. So he works on groundwater contamination for a living, but because of that, he thinks a lot about this stuff, and he thinks about it every time he gets a drink of water. So I want to play just the first couple of minutes or minute or so of this audio story, just so you can hear kind of how this has affected him. When Keith Rapp gets a drink of water in his kitchen, it's quite a process.
In our house, here's how the water comes in.
It goes through a filter on the back of his refrigerator, then through another one inside the fridge.
And so I'm now pouring filtered water into a Brita pitcher.
Finally, he pours it into a water bottle with its own carbon filter in the cap.
And you take your water bottle, screw the top on, pull it up, and ready to go. And so that's how we do water here.
Rapp lives in Woodbury, part of the East Twin Cities metro where the groundwater was contaminated by chemicals produced for decades by 3M. Officially, the city water here is safe to drink. But Rapp is a hydrogeologist who deals with groundwater contamination for a living. He's worried about the possible effects of perfluorochemicals, or PFCs, since he first learned of their presence more than a decade ago.
From day one, because I knew what the potential risks were.
Rapp and many others, when Keith Rapp gets a drink of water in his kitchen, it's quite a process. So this is why I love radio and why I love telling stories like this, because there's really no way I could have conveyed that myself. But in this case, Keith was able to explain what he goes through to get a drink of water. He puts his water through 4 filters, basically, before he'll drink it. And, maybe that's overkill, but that's how he thinks about his water. That's the fear and the concern that he has and his family have over the potential contamination in their water. So I think that's what I like about my job so much, is that I'm able to show how people are affected by the decisions that we all make as consumers, as companies, as landowners, as just humans, and how those affect our natural resources. And, there's been a lot of research done on how humans learn, and a lot of it is through narrative. Stories help us process and remember information, they give meaning to data, and they make people care. It's the way that we sort of make sense of the world. I know it's the way that I do. So I hope that by telling these stories, I can share all of the knowledge and the, the important work that you're all doing with people in a way that they can understand and access. But I'm not able to do it alone, so that's where you all come in. And I'm always interested in story ideas. You can call me, you can drop me a note, you can send me feedback, you can yell at me, I can take it. Tell us what issues we should be writing more about. We don't always just write depressing stories. We're also interested in hearing about the interesting work that you're all doing, or the research, or the interesting lives you're living. And I know that this is really important right now, right? Because there's this public skepticism and mistrust of science and scientists. And that's real. And I think it's more important than ever to try to communicate what you're doing and why it matters. I used to work in newspapers. I still love newspapers, but the unfortunate reality is that a lot of newspapers don't have the resources anymore to devote someone full-time to writing about science and environmental issues. I'm fortunate that I work at NPR, where we do invest in those resources. I work with a team of environmental reporters. We write not just about water, but about the impacts of climate change and agriculture and mining, and we all kind of work together to try to tackle those issues. So I hope to hear from all of you. In the meantime, keep thinking and writing and talking about water. There's a quote from National Geographic that I really like that says, "All the water that ever will be is right now." And I think that's really something to think about. So thank you for having me here, and I'm happy to take some questions.
How can we best help you ID and produce meaningful water resource stories? News releases, social posts, fully sourced stories, direct pitches. How do you prefer to receive tips?
All of the above. My preference is to have relationships with my sources that I trust and be talking to them regularly about their work. That's the ideal world for me, I guess. Because, then we can be talking about things as you're working on them, and it's not a last-minute thing where I'm trying to get up to speed and you're trying to explain 2 years' worth of work in 5 minutes, and, that's not ideal. But, we work in the real world, so the reality is most journalists are on deadline all the time, pretty much. We do have a limited amount of time. So email tips are great, phone calls are better, social media is good too. I use all of the above. Always an actual conversation, a face-to-face conversation is preferable. And, just so you know, I know that sometimes there's frustration with journalists that we just write the quick headline to get the clicks, and we don't always fully read the story or fully understand. I think good journalists do read the report. They do try to understand as much as they can. I actually just turned down a story this week because I did an interview with the researcher. It's great work. It's really interesting stuff, but it's not quite there yet. I want to have the data to be able to look at. I want to be able to ask him how many samples he took, where did he take them, what are the limitations of this study, what don't you know that you still need to try to find out, all of those things. And I think we'll write about it at some point, but we're not quite there yet. So I would say, don't be afraid. I know sometimes it's kind of scary when we call. You maybe don't want to take that call. But, talk to the journalists and take the time to explain, because most of us really are willing to try to listen and learn.
Thank you. Next question is, how do we best tell people's personal stories when their perceptions conflict with science? That one's loaded, so.
It is loaded. I mean, I actually love those stories that are kind of counterintuitive, that maybe, are not the conventional thinking. They maybe change how you think or perceive something. So I kind of find those stories to be a challenge. And if you pitch me those stories, I probably will be interested. They might be more challenging. It might take more explanation, more data. It might, to explain why someone's conventional thinking is not accurate. I think there's, one of the problems I think with media reporting on science, especially like these reports that come out and people jump on them, and it's, red wine is good for you today, but last week it wasn't, and there's sort of this public whiplash that happens where people say, well, none of this is real. And I think that's kind of feeding into the skepticism that the public might have about science. So I think it's really helpful if you talk to the journalists and explain what the study really says. Like it's not the definitive whole, be all end all study. It's one sample, one survey, or it's looking at one aspect of the research, and explain those limitations. Explain what the study actually says, and then what it can't say. I mean, what you're not able to say. That's important to tell the journalists as well.
Can you compare how public radio and for-profit media differ in reporting on water and the environment?
Well, I've worked for both. There's good journalists working at both, so I'm not here to disparage for-profit media at all. I think I mentioned earlier just the limitations right now at a lot of newspapers, not all, but a lot have had to cut back on their science or environmental reporting. I feel like the benefits of working for NPR are that we are listener supported, and our listeners measure really high on that curiosity index that I talked about. I mean, when we've done audience research stories, our audience is like more curious than the average person, which I love. That's the best audience you could have. So to me, that's a great benefit, and the fact that they support us, both financially and by listening to us and talking about us. They want to hear these stories. I mean, they really do. They're interested. They're curious. I get feedback when I write them. So that should be comforting to all of you, that there are people out there who do care.
Should scientists be advocates for the environment, or should that task fall to journalists or activists? How does the public perceive scientists that are vocal environmental advocates? I mean,
I do think there's some skepticism about scientists that have, really taken an advocacy position. I know as a journalist, we don't advocate for policy. I, stay clear of that. I'm trying to write about issues and be informative and explanatory, but I don't advocate one way or the other. And on policy positions, we'll talk to people on both sides of the issue. I'm not going to presume to tell all of you what to do, because I know there's scientists who feel differently about this, but yeah.
Not editorializing then, huh?
I think we'll stay clear.
How does this current visibility given to fake news affect public trust in our media sources?
Yeah, I think it's huge. I think I'm really excited. I'm actually talking to a class at the U of M this afternoon about this very same issue. Like how do you recognize fake news, and how do you, how do real journalists gauge information and weigh it and try to maintain that credibility? So I think this is really big. I think we can try to counter this by providing as many informative, explanatory stories as we can, and be upfront about what we know and don't know. And what I'm going to talk to this class about this afternoon is the kinds of things that I look at. If I get a study or a report or news release or something like that, how do I gauge whether it's newsworthy, whether it has value, and the kinds of things I look for? So, who's paying for this study? What was the sample size? What are the study's limitations? All of those kinds of things that journalists should be weighing before they write about something.
Look deeper.
Look deeper, definitely, always. Mm-hmm.
How can we make groundwater and the related challenges more visible to Minnesotans?
I think that's huge. I think people don't think about groundwater the same because you can't see it, right? And they're very familiar with their favorite lake or their favorite river, and they just don't think about, when they turn on their tap, that it's coming from down below, but that that water down there is the same water, and it's being influenced by many of the same factors. So again, I think the more we can talk about groundwater, the more, and I think there is some growing awareness of this. And good or bad, things like Flint, Michigan, I think people start to think more about the safety of their drinking water more than they used to. And I think just the more we can talk about it and write about it, the better.
Got a lot of questions, apparently. Will NPR write an...
Good question.
Did you see it? I didn't get to finish it.
Not planning on it, but if any of you have some news you want to share with me, I'll meet me afterward. No, I know there was a lot of really great sessions today. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend many, but I'm taking the materials with me, and I'm always open to phone calls and conversations.
Can you suggest hints for us on how to speak in plain language about science?
This is my biggest frustration with scientists, is that you're so smart, but it's like somehow communication can be a challenge. In my interviews, I sometimes sound like a third grader, or maybe even like a kindergartner. I do a lot of, explain this to me, tell me, share, show me, because it gets people talking about things in a more basic way. I think, obviously, jargon, and you don't even know you're using jargon because it's become so much of just a habit, a pattern. It's the language of your profession, right? So you don't even know you're doing it. Acronyms, you just kind of roll off the tongue. And so I think if you can think about how you would explain this to your grandma or your child or, your next door neighbor, how do you explain what you do? And, get to the point. I think sometimes scientists feel like they need to kind of give you all of the fine print, right? Everything about the study first, and then they kind of bury the lead in the bottom. And it's almost like the reverse of that. Like, tell me, what's the key takeaway here? What did you find out? What did you learn? And then we can talk about all the other stuff. And that's important to know. Like, I want to know, are there other factors that could be influencing this outcome? Or, I want to know all the limitations of the study. But let's talk first about the key point. Try to get that, high up in your conversation, in your story, in your press release, whatever. And then, just simplify, and I don't mean this in a bad way, because I don't want you to have to dumb down your work. I know it's important. I know you put a lot of research into it and a lot of work. But sometimes I think there's a lot there that maybe isn't as important to those key points that you're trying to make. So having those conversations, I think, with a journalist that's just willing to take the time and sit down and ask you those questions, I think over time it gets easier.
One last question, I believe. It's getting close. What was the most surprising thing you learned about water resources from your time reporting on water stories?
Oh, that's a good one. I think just the amount that we don't know. I think I figured when I came into this beat, I had done some environmental reporting, but this was the first time I would be focusing 100% on water. And I just figured I just have to learn everything that's out there, and then I'll be smart and I'll be able to report about this. And I think I didn't realize how much this is constantly changing, and there's so much evolving all the time. I just went to the Minnesota Department of Health's forum a couple weeks ago on emerging contaminants, and the focus was microplastics. And you talk about a whole field of research that's just changing all the time, and some just amazing stuff happening and scary stuff. And I think I realized then that this is going to be a full-time job, just trying not only just learning what's out there, but keeping up with what's happening all the time. And water, maybe more than any other topic, is just the science is always changing, which is good.
Well, on behalf of the Water Resources Committee, the University of Minnesota, and all of the people here, we thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.